This is the video podcast for TheoFantastique, and I have a glutton for punishment as a guest today, Doug Cowan, who's been at TheoFantastique in text interviews, and we've done at least one video interview. I know we did an audio podcast in the past.
Back in the day.
That's right. This is a man who needs no introduction, but we'll introduce him anyways. Professor of Religious Studies and Social Development Studies at Renison University College. He is a prolific scholar and author and a good friend. And let me welcome you to the podcast once again.
Well, it's great to be here. I'm expecting that in 5 years you and I will do this holographically.
I like that idea.
You know,
me, Doug Cowan, you're my only hope. There you go. Today we're going to talk about one of Doug's most recent books, Magic, Monsters, and Make-Believe Heroes: How Myth and Religion Shape Fantasy Culture. Like I said, he's a prolific author. One of the things that has struck me, you say this in the book, and I've heard you say it in other interviews about the book, that this is one of the more difficult books that you've written. You and I have talked about your book on science fiction and religion, horror and religion. We talked about Stephen King. What is it about this book on fantasy that made it more difficult to write?
I think one of the things is because fantasy is such a huge range. It's hybridized. You've got science fantasy, horror fantasy. It's so broad and it's so prolific. Is how do you pare it down, right? How do you pare it down into what you want to talk about? What do you choose? What do you leave out? I mean, one of the things I say in the introduction is, why talk about martial arts movies and not Westerns, which are clearly, or why not an entire chapter devoted to spy movies? Because, you know, The Long Kiss Goodnight, The Gold Standard, James Bond, Salt, these kinds of things, they're as much fantasy as they are anything else. How do you avoid sort of the big items? Game of Thrones is really, really popular right now. And one of the things I tried to avoid in all the books I do is kind of coattailing on what's the most popular. Mm-hmm. So, spoiler alert, if people are looking for all kinds of stuff on Game of Thrones in here, you're not going to see it.
Right.
Because you've got to have some sort of critical distance from a pop culture product in order to be able to say something about it. And I mean, Game of Thrones is interesting for a couple of reasons. I mean, I don't know if you watch it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, sure. So what was really interesting in the first few seasons was watching Game of Thrones and then going to like discussion boards on the internet where you have sort of the textual literalists. Mm-hmm. Who are sort of fighting with the artistic avant-garde, and they're kind of battling it out at their own little battle of Winterfell, because, you know, that's not the way it was in the book, right? This doesn't happen. So the idea of how do you draw enough of a conceptual path through a genre that is so vast and in a way disorganized, but so popular as fantasy, in a way that lets you say something sort of reasonable and consistent throughout the book. So probably that was the hardest thing. The other hard thing, and I sort of hinted this, but I didn't really talk about it too much, is this book, more than any of the ones that I've written, is kind of a love letter to the stories that I grew up with. I was never really a horror fan, even though I've written a lot about horror. I love science fiction, but science fantasy was like my thing back in the day. And so I want to make sure that it's also sort of has some intellectual integrity. So it doesn't come off as, you know, it's just another fanboy, you know, writing about things that he likes. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah. I've done enough Salt Lake City FanX and Comic-Con, and on panels where you don't get a whole lot of depth. It is a bunch of fanboys and fangirls just kind of fawning over, oh, isn't it great? As come on, I thought we were going to...
Yeah, I thought we were going to talk about this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, feeding off of that response, if you're trying to maintain some kind of academic distance to be able to analyze the material, how do you balance that with those elements of fantasy culture that you're passionate about, that you want to explore?
I think what it is just making sure that whenever you're talking about something, you're trying to say something significant about it. For example, Mad Max Fury Road, right? When I went and saw it with a couple of friends of mine, closing credits roll, both my friends turn to me and they say, because they know I'm a Mad Max head, they both turn to me and they say, "What did you think?" I said, "That movie made me completely happy." Now, I could just say, well, it's an awesome movie and all this kind of thing. But the point is to try and find something that a reader who may not know about it, who may have only heard about it, who may have seen it and didn't like it. What I want to do is say, look, here's a different way of looking at this. For example, there was a guy who I wrote about in the book, and he said, it was just a terrible movie. Mad Max is weirdly inarticulate. It's filled with things that his problem seems to be that it's not realistic enough.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, dude, it's Mad Max.
Right.
Like, come on. And, and like, where are they getting all the gasoline? That's his problem. The other problem he had was, he says, that Furiosa, who's Charlize Theron's character, she's this woman who accepts Mad Max's leadership. And I said, and I wrote in the book, I said, you paid your money for your ticket. You're entitled to what you think about it. But here's another way of looking at it. And it's two things. One, anybody who thinks this movie is a Mad Max movie has missed the point. It's Furiosa's movie. She is the central character, right? Mad Max is at best, Max Rockatansky is at best incidental to the plot. The second thing, if you think that she accepts his leadership in any more than a utilitarian fashion, they have not watched the movie close enough, because you have to think about where we tell, when you think about our stories, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, think about when you tell the story of something. There's a cat that's attack you from behind. That's a little bit freaky. That's like
she's attached to the hip for me. So.
That's a Pet Cemetery shit right there. So, anyway, she's willing to use him to accomplish her mission. But as I write in the book, the moment she senses he's a threat, she will put a 9mm bullet right through his head.
Yeah.
So it's not so the idea of this is in a chapter on warrior heroines. This genre that kind of gets, anytime a superhero movie fails that it has a female lead, they say, oh, it's because it's a female lead. Well, sometimes that is, but sometimes that's just a sexist way of looking at it, right? So I've forgotten what the original question was. I know. Because I loved it so much, rather than simply gushing about it, the task for a scholar, the task for an academic, is to say, okay, what is it more than just likability, or what is it more than just appeal that makes this a useful movie or an important movie, or even fun for somebody who doesn't know about it, who isn't a part of it, right? One of the nicest things that a reviewer of this book said, one of the external reviewers, was, there are so many things in this book that I don't know about, like games or movies or franchises that I'm not a part of, that I'm not in the fandom of, but now I want to be because of having read this book. That, for me, that hits the bullseye in terms of what I'm trying to get at. Right. So, I mean, one of the things that I do is, because there's also the movies that I'm pretty clear that I don't like, because I will never stop ragging on James Cameron's Titanic. I know that, I mean, you and I were talking earlier that when people ask me what's my favorite movie, it's always between Alien and Blade Runner. But that doesn't mean that I don't love Aliens and I don't love Terminator 2. I mean, James Cameron does so many. The Abyss is one of my favorite movies. Right. But then I go to Titanic, and I wrote in the introduction, that's 3 hours and 14 minutes of my life that James Cameron owes me back. Right. So, but in a way, I use that as an example, because whether I like a movie or not is not the important thing. right? For hundreds of millions of people, Titanic will always be their favorite movie ever, right? So simply liking something or not liking something is not enough to say about it. So one of the things that I'm trying to do in this book and all of my other books about popular culture is, how do we ask the questions that allow us to say something important about whether even movies that are not really very good.
Right. Sounds like we're on the same page. I used to be a guest and do some writing for TheoFantastique online. And I think the approach there, they engage in some analysis, but it's largely a movie review.
Yeah.
And for me, when I was working with them, it's whether the film is good or not, does it raise some interesting ideas that we can look at and explore? So you're not engaged in just a glorified or deeper form of film review. You're doing something.
No.
Yeah.
It's exactly the opposite what I'm
Right.
hoping to do. If it comes off as that, then I would, in my view, if it
Right.
comes off as that, then I've failed.
Okay. Well, you were talking about what do you look at? How do we define genres and so on? Let me ask a personal question of opinion here for you in terms of genre. And I've gotten in trouble myself online in weighing in with my opinion in what people would consider fantasy films. You have individuals who would disappear and reappear in another location, right? In science fiction, for example, Star Trek, a franchise you and I love deeply. I'm a big fan of the original. Instead of disappearing and reappearing, we do that with transporters.
Right.
So in many times, isn't science fiction kind of a scientificized, or whatever term I'm looking for here, a technological overlay over fantasy to make it more palatable for a slightly different audience? Am I off base here?
No, I think
hard sci-fi.
I think you're right on point. And to all your Twitter followers who are going to hate on you for this, here's the thing. There was a science fiction writer and column and essayist named Thomas Dish, who basically defined the difference between science fiction and fantasy this way. He said, sci-fi is rocket ships, fantasy is flying carpets. Right? Now, and we all know Clarke's third law, right? All of that kind of stuff. But
Right.
the thing about fantasy that I try to get at in this book is a couple of things. One is it's framed in the context of an unnatural narrative, which is to say a thing that cannot possibly be true, right? Humans cannot possibly turn into wolves. We are too genetically dissimilar. So there has to be some fantastic element, even though you can look at a movie like one of the old, like 1951, Bride of the Gorilla, right, where some mad scientist, right, is combining gorilla DNA and which, by the way, was totally sent up on The Big Bang Theory with Penny and her only nude scene when she's like the killer ape.
Right.
So there's that. But the other thing is to recognize that fantasy and science fiction as mythic narratives don't operate in sort of pigeonholes. It's either sci-fi or it's fantasy. They operate across a pretty broad continuum that includes a number of hybrids throughout. So, we don't have any idea whether warp drive will work, right? And
Right.
then, never mind warp drive, I want to be in the writer's room for Star Trek Discovery when somebody first came up with the idea. I know, mushrooms. That's how they travel, right? So recognizing that there is this hybridization throughout and there's this crossover. There is, of course, what we might call full-on otherworld fantasy, which is Narnia. Is a full-on otherworld fantasy. You go there, right? You walk through the wardrobe and you are in Narnia. The Lord of the Rings is a full-on fantasy narrative. It's high fantasy. It exists in a world that contains creatures that are not like us, right? That don't exist. It's so when you have at a con, right? So you have Borg walking around. I don't know why people want to be nameless drones, but never mind. So you have these Borgs. The idea that we can cybernetically enhance, the idea that we can connect through a computer cybernetically, right? So that this might be the far end of the possible. That's science fiction, right? You go to the same con and you see people walking around as orcs, right? Or hobbits or wizards or dwarfs. When they walk out of the con, they're in the parking lot, and there's no possibility that, do you know what I mean?
Right,
there's no possibility that they're going to be hobbits or orcs or wizards there. The Borg walks out into the parking lot, and you go, you know what? Maybe this shit might happen one day, because so recognizing that fantasy as a mythic narrative, as a way of asking the same questions over and over and over again, because that was the thing that really drove this book. I often write books or I get involved in projects because I'm tired of hearing sort of a pat, cliched answer. So Sacred Terror got written because I heard somebody say, you just don't expect to find religion in horror. And I go, well, that's just wrong, dude. Science fiction, a lot of what you read, you've read it. A lot of what you read about science fiction is about putting religion in its place.
Right.
It's about, religion is just sort of primitive in its past, and the religious imagination it's the sort of scientific future.
Right.
That's wrong. Right. America's Dark Theologian was, why should anybody take Stephen King seriously? He pumps out, 3 books a year and they're all crap. Well, I wrote an entire book suggesting, here's why you need to take this seriously. The thing that I get tired of hearing that sort of led to the idea of magic monsters and make-believe heroes is the complaint, and I'm sure you've heard this, why can't Hollywood come up with new ideas? Why are we always seeing the same story over and over and over, right? Wow, my God, it's just, I watched Crazy Rich Asians. Do you know that movie?
I haven't seen it, but yeah.
Yeah, and I'm going, okay, well, this is kind of, I had friends who were like gushing about it. I'm watching this, I'm going, okay, it's kind of, and I went, they get to the wedding scene, and I went, this is Cinderella. Right down to the puffy sleeved blue dress that they put the Cinderella character in. So this whole book is about, why do we tend to tell the same stories?
Well, you've got a chapter in your book on magic. How important is magic to fantasy? What are some of the ways it's used, and why does it continue to be popular in a scientific age? I thought supposedly we moved away from all of this as human beings.
Well, sorry to disillusion you, my friend. But magic, the chapter on magic is interesting because, for a couple of reasons. One is we remain in love with the idea as human beings. We remain absolutely in love with the idea of being able to control our environment, to make changes in our environment to suit our own needs. The 2 things I think that are really significant about that chapter, or at least I try to make significant. One is this ongoing dispute in the academy and religious studies to try and make some differentiation between religion, which is good, and religion, which is real, and religion, which deals with real things, and magic, which is not good, which doesn't deal with real things. And so I look at it and go, okay, you've got 2 sets of invisible friends, right? Gods, religious, 2 sets of, a set of invisible friends over here that society has evolved to say Yes, these are real. God is real. God answers prayer. All of that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Not so much empirical evidence for it, but never mind. Over here, you've got magic. There's a whole bunch of other invisible friends that are not sanctioned by society. But when you raise the idea up that tell me what the fundamental distinction between these is, if you think about the guy that I keep going back to is William James, right? Over and over and over and over and over. Varieties of religious experience. Right now, I'm working on part of the notes for what will be the companion volume to Dark Theologian, which is called America's Reluctant Prophet. And it's the religious imagination of Philip K. Dick. And Philip K. Dick, was one of his favorite books, was Varieties of Religious Experience. Now, the definition that I've used from Varieties for years and years and years is this idea that there is an unseen order, and that that our supreme good lies in harmoniously adjusting ourselves to that order. So the idea is that, okay, religion does it a certain way, or what we categorize as religion does it a certain way, a socially sanctioned way. Magic is trying to do exactly the same thing. It imagines that there is this unseen order of forces, that we have a supreme good, and that we can somehow adjust ourselves to that. Right? So the idea, I call it this brief side quest, to talk about religion and magic. And at the end, I basically wind up agreeing with Ronald Hutton, this British historian, and saying, it's a false dichotomy. The other thing about magic that's really important is that I think is how we find ways to use magic and magical creatures and people who claim to control magical powers as a way of talking about our different cultural fears. So I think I do that as fearing magic. So you have all these movies where the witch, even like a couple of years ago, there was that movie, The Witch, where the witch is the magical being is the threat, is the preeminent threat. So we're constantly kind of reinforcing this idea of a magical other as a threat. So how do we deal with it? Well, we can domesticate it. Right? Remember Bell, Book, and Candle, the old right? And Gillian Holroyd, who's Kim Novak's character, has to give up her magical powers in order to become human and marry the human. She has to give up her powers for love. Just a few years later, you have Bewitched, where the idea is, Samantha, no twitching of the nose today, right? As Darren goes off to work.
Right.
And then it's all about how she twitches the nose. So it's not about it. It's about the attempt to domesticate that is always subverted by the magical other. Then you have, how do you evangelize magic? And this is everybody who's ever written the Gospel According to Anything book. Right? Where we take, what we're going to do is we're going to take our religious beliefs, and we're going to map them onto this onto this pop culture in a way that makes it palatable for us.
Right.
So that all your friends who are whose kids are reading Harry Potter and not admitting it to their parents because it's about witchcraft, right? Well, Harry's actually a Christ figure.
Right.
You know what I mean? And so you got something like, The Gospel According to Disney, which is a book I take a pretty hard stance on in mine, which is basically saying, look, you can do this if you want, but don't pretend this is actually what's going on. It's more important to look at the process of how people make things palatable, how they make things amenable to a certain religious community. Then there's embracing magic. So you've got fearing magic, domesticating magic, resisting magic, which is sort of evangelizing it. You resist it by bringing it onto your side. Then you've got embracing magic. And that is my dirty little secret that I will share with your listeners. I'm a total Charmed fan. I loved Charmed from the beginning to the end, because the whole first set of episodes are about these young women coming to terms with this thing that should not possibly be in their lives, like they're witches. And one of the first couple of episodes is about Piper, Holly Marie Combs' character, going into a church. And, she goes to step into the church and there's thunder in the background. So is that God? Is God watching me? Am I bad because I'm a witch? And then she talks to this minister of this church who ticks all the multicultural boxes. He's African American. He's young. He's hip. He's like, well, let's just rap about these kind of things, but you shouldn't suffer. But then he goes right back to, well, you shouldn't suffer a witch to live. So we got to be pretty careful about that. So when you talk about magic, it's important to unpack what the different messages culture is reinforcing through that idea. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I appreciate the mention of Bewitched, but I was always slightly more a fan of I Dream of Jeannie. I'm sorry, Barbara Eden just was a little
more for you than Elizabeth Montgomery.
Yeah, but it was basically the same kind of.
It was totally the same.
Yeah.
My favorite Martian was the same. They're all what the guy's name escapes me, but he calls them magical situation comedies. So you have Bewitched, you have I Dream of Jeannie, you have the Munsters, the Addams Family. All of these are in the same time period, right? And then you have Gilligan's Island. Gilligan's Island is a magical situation. It's a fantasy.
Yeah.
And I talk about the fantasy of Gilligan's Island because I'm sorry, Professor. Love you to death, Russell.
You can't do what he did with coconuts?
I know, right? I know, right? Sadly gone now, Russell Johnson. But when you actually, when you see Russell Johnson show up as a B character in a bunch of these like old Roger Corman movies,
right?
He's always the guy they're getting to fix the radio.
Yeah.
Right? Like
he was kind of the Magus figure on Gilligan's Island.
Exactly. Yeah. He's always like Attack of the Crab Monsters, right? He's the guy that got fixing the radio. So it's a magical situation comedy. There are things. So if we're looking at a narrative that cannot possibly happen, you can't build a radio out of coconuts. What is it that is so attractive about this then? What is it that keeps? There is. It was a couple of years ago I looked at this, but according to what I saw, there is no time zone now in the world where Gilligan's Island is not replaying at this very moment. It is still super popular.
Yeah.
So the question becomes, why? And that's what I tried to get at in the book.
Yeah. You've got some discussion, a couple of chapters on the Mythic Hero, and you look at it from the perspectives of East and West.
Yeah.
What are some basic ways those things are similar and different? And with our globalized world and the internet, how those kind of blended together in fantasy?
The first part of your question has to do with this book. The second part of your question has to do with another project that I'm working on called Fighting Spirit, How Myth and Religion Shape the Martial Arts. And for example, in the East, when you look at Asian martial arts movies, one of the relationships that is really, really important is the community. Whether it's a Kung Fu school, whether it's the Shaolin Monastery, whether it is the local town, the idea is that your identity is tied up in the community. And that when you go out of the community, the movement is to bring you back into the way the community functions. Often that's done through the master and the student. So you have this idea of a teacher and a student. So Drunken Master, movies, Jackie Chan's Drunken Master, is about how does Jackie go out and get trained and then come back to the community. It's the Karate Kid, right? It's all of these stories. And so there's that dynamic that goes on in the East. Not entirely and not universally,
Mm-hmm.
right? There are lone samurai and lone wandering swordsmen.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there is a long-running manga and anime whose title, translates as Wandering Swordsman,
Mm-hmm.
right? But it is also about him finding community,
Mm-hmm.
right? The transitional character for that is from the east to the west is Kwai Chang Caine, David Carradine in Kung Fu,
Mm-hmm.
because the original episodes they play with this. He's in this community of the Shaolin Temple. It's all very soft focused. It's all, there's almost like a starlight filter,
Right.
right, on the
Yeah.
candles, and everybody's like very, well, Grasshopper, water flows downhill. You go, oh, yes, water flows downhill. And then there's the horrible event. And then he's sent and all of a sudden he is a man in the wilderness. And when you first see in the first episode, you see him transitioning from being a member of this community to a guy walking alone across this trackless desert, right? So he's the transition. In the West, what you see is this, rather than finding community and the mythic hero being wrapped up in the context of community. In the West, what you find is this stranger coming to town narrative. So Shane, Pale Rider, High Plains Drifter, the Outlaw Josie Wales, you can name them. Mad Max. It's the stranger coming in from the wasteland, saving the community. But even though he's offered, or she is offered, a place in the community, they cannot stay. So, come back, Shane. It's the most famous line in
Right.
Western cinema,
Oh yeah.
right? Come back, Shane. That's Papagallo
Mm-hmm.
looking at Mad Max and saying, you can have a home here. And him looking at the lost of the V8 Interceptors, saying, that's all the home I need. So, you've got, so he comes in, but he's never able, or she is never able to live in community.
Mm-hmm.
So it's almost a transitional moment. They're back
Mm-hmm.
into the they're back into the wasteland. I just want to look at the chapter for a sec. So say something meaningful while I do this.
Oh, the Book of Eli comes to mind. Is
The Book of Eli.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm just looking at
Which to me was an interesting film because I think the director tried to make it as, let's talk about how important the Bible is. But as I look at have you seen the film?
Yeah.
I mean, to me, it's fascinating. And, the book, the Bible played a part in this massive war, possibly a nuclear war. And it's used and abused by people throughout the film. So it really doesn't.
Maybe we should not fetishize it
Right,
quite
exactly.
so much.
Yeah.
Well, so I was just looking to see what again, in the introduction, I said, how do you choose what you're going to deal with, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the single most important story that gets repeated over and over and over in Western culture for the kind of the hero figure is the Once and Future King. It's Arthur, right? There are any number of adaptations of Arthur, right? And so I looked at a number of them to see not what is similar about them, because that's not what's interesting. Jonathan Z. Smith, the historian of religions who passed away a couple of years ago, in my view, one of his most important statements was that the significance of comparison, of comparing things, does not lie in pointing out similarities. It lies in explaining difference. So that's what I try to teach my students is, let's not say, what do these different tellings of Arthur have in common? But what is the difference in the way these stories are told? What does that say about the different questions that we bring? For example, Disney's Sword in the Stone brings a very different set of questions to the story of Arthur than does Antoine Fuqua's King Arthur, which, by the way, is simply a 5th century remake of Tears of the Sun. which the military rescue epic he made the year before.
Mm.
It's almost a shot-for-shot remake. So he phoned that one in a little bit. Um, but if you think about Disney, you think about, we'll switch to Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs runs for about 70 minutes. 11 minutes of that, think of that, 70 minutes. 11 minutes of that is taken up with one scene. It's the scene that people remember. And it's the washing up scene before dinner. Can you imagine 70 minutes of a film? Right? 11 in an age where you cut down single frames to compress time. 11 minutes are taken with us. Hey, it's good, clean fun. Let's all wash up before dinner. Well, this intruder in their house says, until you wash up, there'll be no supper for you. This is the intruder basically threatening, the pseudo mom, threatening to send them to bed without their dinner. But can you imagine your kids, they watch this and they love it, and the dwarves are washing up, and you're trying to get your 5-year-old granddaughter to wash up for dinner, and you go, it's just like the dwarfs, right?
Right.
So that's the message. Cleanliness is good. Hygiene is good. Sword in the Stone. The message in Sword in the Stone is brains conquers brawn every time. That's the message that is consistent. So you compare that with something like, I said, King Arthur, with Excalibur, which is totally dark, right? You see Patrick Stewart's in that, and it's about the waning of religion, the waning of the old religions in the land, because as the wedding takes place between Arthur and Guinevere, Merlin and Morgaine are looking on, and he says, our ways are passing from the world of men. Then you compare that to something like the Mists of Avalon, which is the story of Arthur told from the perspective of the three most important women in his life. And it's very much this, what happens to the gods? So the idea of comparing these things, of choosing a palette of things to compare, is not about pointing out how they're similar. I read articles and chapters like that all the time. And I think it's just a wrong-headed approach. It's not about pointing out similarity. It's about explaining why these things are different, or explaining how they're different and why that difference matters.
One last question for you from my end, unless there's something you want to bring out about the book that I've missed, just to trying to hit some highlights here. As a professor of religion, as you look at whether it's fantasy, science fiction, horror, what have you, the importance of these stories for human beings. And in America, as well as in the broader West, you've got the decline of institutional religion, and people are looking and creating alternative forms of spirituality and meaning for themselves. Do you see fantasy and other forms of genre playing an increasingly important role in the construction of these new narratives for people?
Absolutely. And it's not an increasingly important role. It's always been an important role. And for the reason, for what I may have said this before, but, fantasy is about things that cannot possibly happen. High fantasy is about things that cannot possibly happen. I said, really? You mean things like Muhammad flying from Jerusalem from Mecca to Jerusalem on a winged horse? You mean fantasy like things that you mean like a guy living inside a fish for 3 days? You mean things like that that can't happen? We are enthralled by fantasy because we have always been able to raise up unnatural narratives, things that can't possibly be true, and hold them in tension with what we see around us. We just happen to call it religion. Right? Religion is not only filled with these things, it's predicated on them. Now, where I think this is really important, and it's a really good question to end with, as I'm sort of progressing in this work, and like the Philip K. Dick book and some other stuff that I'm doing, what I'm starting to make more and more of a distinction between is the difference between religion and the religious imagination. And the way I am thinking about it now, and you interview me in 2 years holographically, it may be different, but all religion is a function of the religious imagination. Everything that emerges in the world, is objectivated in the world as religion, is a function of the religious imagination. But not all products of the religious imagination emerge into the world as religion.
Mm. Mm.
Right? Like all apples are fruits, but not all fruits are apples.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So you get, when you see, this is one of the things that makes me crazy when I read so-called pop culture analyses of, or analyses of religion and pop culture, and they say, well, you know, that can't possibly be true because there are no such thing as Ferengi. And I go, dude, you're just missing the point. You've totally missed the point. It is a part, it's a function of the religious imagination to imagine how an unseen order might work. Doesn't mean it will necessarily come out as, emerge as religion.
Mm-hmm.
But it might. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And now you're seeing, you know, the hyper real spiritualities and all kinds of.
Exactly.
It's fascinating. So there really aren't, even though some academics and a lot of people in religion, practicing religious adherents, make these hard divisions. They really are just
there is a certain defensiveness about
yeah.
it, I think.
Oh, yeah.
You know, do you know what I mean? There's a certain, when people say, well, that can't possibly be religion. Really? The longest organized church of a modern pagan church in the United States is called the Church of All Worlds.
Oh, yeah.
1962.
Yeah.
You know the novel it's based on? Robert Heinlein's Stranger in a Strange Land. And it's based explicitly on it. Tim Zell said, this would make a great way to found a faith.
Mm-hmm.
And he did, and it's the Church of All Worlds, and they're still going. So the idea that fiction and fantasy and stories of things that can't possibly be true are being set aside for this sort of scientific narrative,
Mm-hmm.
not happening, not going to happen.
Yeah. Anything I missed that you want to say about the book?
No, you've done a really good job. Go and buy
Well,
it. It makes an excellent Christmas gift,
does
Hanukkah gift, Kwanzaa gift.
I'll put a link to Amazon for folks to pick up the book. Yeah, we got Mother's Day coming up. Mom would love it.
Mom would love it. Warrior heroine, because moms are warrior heroines, right?
That's right. And if not, in June you got Dad will love it, and of course Christmas and all that good stuff. So
all that,
copy.
Yeah, and just because it would be great as a just because gift.
That's right. That's right. It's always a pleasure, my friend. I appreciate you
as well.
time. All right.
Okay.
Thank you, folks. Doug Cowan, pick up the book.